work in this
Denise
area.
is doing a PhD too.
Well,
She feels my pain.
I feel your pain extremely. So it's fantastic to hear with regards to Sylvana's research. So let me get you going.
Thanks. I'm just looking to see if my supervisor's in the audience because I'm still a little bit scared of the machine. Can't see, but that's good. Chris, I'm thinking of you and Danielle. My issue is that I'm too short and I never can be seen above this podium, so I'm sorry if you can't really see me. I hope I'm reaching into the microphone well enough. So thank you, Denise, for the introductions. Thanks to the previous two presenters. It's an honour to be here presenting with you. It is 8 years in the making. We started this journey quite a few years ago in 2011 as a bit of a springboard from the introduction of individualised funding program around children with autism in 2008. Also, my son has a disability. He's 28 years old, and he commenced using it in a very bespoke pilot individualised program when he left high school, and he started that in 2009. And my interest as the CEO of Plumtree, working with families of very little children, was to really look at how individual funding schemes were going to impact the early childhood intervention sector and families. I am not going to dwell too much on the things that some of you researchers may be most interested in, because I'd like to get to talk about the results a little bit more in my 18.2, counting down 20 seconds minutes, and won't be presenting those individually by phases of my results. I'm going to talk to them generally around my research questions. Thanks, Denise, you've introduced a little bit of context there. The research is qualitative, exploring the similar and different views of both families of children using individualised funding, experienced with using individualised funding, and also professionals who were delivering services that were delivered through the payment of funds through an individualised approach. The reason that I took this approach was I do believe that it's the people on the ground who are either receiving and delivering that have got a lot to say, and I wanted to shine a light on the voices of those people to help get their views about individualised approaches in early childhood intervention into some research discussion. The research did, as I said, commence in 2011, which was way before the introduction of the NDIS, but our government had been talking about it and we knew it was coming, and that was a little bit more of an impetus to kind of get in there early and start exploring this area. And I hope that some of the points that I'll raise today will have some insight to inform national and international approaches for individualised funding that apply to families of young children with disabilities and those children themselves. So the research questions were: is individual funding compatible with family-centred practice? How do families learn about individual funding? What are families' experiences of the planning process? And what impact does individual funding have on outcomes for children and families? It is an action research methodology with the initial phase in, well, not the phase, the pre-phase, which was the reconnaissance phase in 2011, where I started just looking at where we were going to go with this. And there were 3 phases in the research. They were the think, plan, think, plan, act, do kind of approach. Each phase took a long time because we were doing stuff on the ground. And as many of you know who've done action research, it wasn't a nice, neat, linear approach. It was, I think someone said in the last couple of days, messy chaos, and that's kind of what it felt like as we were going through. As I said, I'm taking the position of insider research. I am the CEO of the organisation that was looking into, participants came from the organisation, and also I did have a bias, as I'll raise one of the limitations, in that my son was using individualised funding in the year that he left high school, and it was a wonderful experience. It really helped him to blossom into a young adult, and it's been very successful in helping wonderful, inclusive life in the community. So that's my bias. And also that the action research methodology, as I said, shining the light and really involving those who are doing it on the ground. And I did have some processes of managing the conflict of interest that I talked through and set up with my supervisors. So in total there were 3 phases over a period of 4 years. In phase 1, 12 participants in total, 6 parents who were experienced with using individualised funding. In the next couple of slides I'll explain how experienced they were. I think that was really critical about this research, is that these families weren't necessarily at the beginning of their journey with using individualised funding. They had experience with multiple types, as I'll show you in a moment, and staff. They were also experienced with multiple types of individual funding, and they had a richness of expertise and experience from each of those schemes, understanding the ins and outs of each, how to make them work for families, and they had some very strong views about what worked and what didn't work to support good early childhood intervention practice in relation to those individual funding schemes. In phase 2, again 21 total participants with 10 parents and 11 staff, and then in the final phase 14 total, 9 parents and 5 staff. So participation was really based on experience with individual funding. So the recruitment processes really were very purposeful in, people volunteered to join, but we were inviting those families who had the most experience with individual funding. We wanted to tap into the expertise of the families. They had a lot to say. The outcome of phase 1 was the development of a program, plan and do. I won't go into that because, as my PhD supervisor keeps saying, your PhD is not your programs. You've got to talk about something bigger than that. But this was, in reality, action research, and we were doing stuff on the ground that really is consistent with the theme of the conference, research into action. So as we were going along, we were thinking and planning and learning and doing and trying to respond to help families and the team to do things better and support families in that individualised funding context while still providing good early childhood intervention experiences. Phase 2, again, we then recruited from families and staff who participated in the delivery of the Plan and Do program. The outcome of that phase was the development of the Now and Next program, which at that time, as a part of the research, in the research phase, it was delivered one-on-one by professionals. And then phase 3, we recruited families and staff participating in and delivering the Now and Next program, and we asked them what they thought about that, and the outcome, which is not part of the research, was that we now developed that, we now have run that program. It's by families for families, so that was the big learning from that cycle, and the program is delivered in groups, not individually. So I will speak to this slide for a few minutes. So individualised funding has not just started for families of young children in Australia with the NDIS. As I said, way back in 2008 to 2018, we had a scheme similar to what the Canadian experience had, helping children with autism, run at a national level, a total of $12,000, $6,000 each year for 2 years, and it must be spent, well, it did have to be spent by the child's 7th birthday. It didn't matter when you got the funding, you got 2 lots, every child got the same amount. There was no differentiation in terms of the needs of the children, and the pressure was on them. The parents had to spend it by the 7th birthday. The families had to spend for this, the focus of it was predominantly allied health based. So there was a list of approved providers, and you could get onto the list of approved providers list if you had an evidence-based early intervention program. And in reality, in practice on the ground, what that meant was the proliferation of services that were delivered by allied health professionals and a diminishing of early intervention services delivered by early childhood educators. It was possible to sneak early childhood educators into transdisciplinary teams but it was really a shift in thinking and a sort of a cementing of thinking in the community's mind, in families' mind, that the quality evidence-based early intervention was delivered by the therapists. That's my bias again, probably coming out there too. That program was then expanded and a few years later. Actually, that date there is wrong. It was probably in 2010 or thereabouts, someone will correct me, that the government then was lobbied heavily to expand this, what was seen as a quite unfair system, targeting funding around children with autism. So another few disabilities, 4 or 5 disabilities were added, and that program was given a different name. It was essentially the same thing. In New South Wales, in the state where I live, the New South Wales government introduced a program which was running for 5 years called the Family Assistance Fund. It was a small bucket of money, $2,000, and anybody birth to 18 was eligible as long as they were receiving a service from the New South Wales Ageing and Disability and Home Care Service, or an organisation that was funded by that body. And that meant that people in reality who were eligible were children and young adults who had a significant disability from around the moderate range above. It was a very flexible scheme that allowed to purchase a wide range of equipment and resources, which would support child and family interactions, relieve stress, improve capacity, including minor home modifications. Very flexible, a one-off payment, pretty much supported by a staff member who was engaged with the organisation that we were working with, and that was it. And then finally, we developed our own bespoke program called Plan and Do. That arose out of the first phase, and how we, it was a hybrid, I'll call it a hybrid model. We received $8,000 directly from the government in block funding at our organisation, and we split that off to say $1,500 would be as flexible as the third item, Family Assistance Fund. So it was $1,500 totally flexible, and families could spend it on anything that they wanted, as long as they could rationalise in their own words on a little sheet: transition, inclusion and partnerships. Anything goes. There was no yes, there was no no's, it was what the families said, how they wrote one sentence to rationalise that it was going to help them towards an individual family goal and child goal that was supporting transition, inclusion and partnership. That was $1,500. The other $7,500 we retained to deliver what we would describe as an evidence-based, transdisciplinary, key worker-focused early childhood intervention service. Now, I'm drawing your attention to this because I do think that after that 8 years, I see this as potentially a critical discussion that we can have. We'll come back at the end. We separated off individual funding to allow families to have flexible funding to meet family, community, child developmental kind of needs, inclusion needs, and segregated and separated a larger component of the funding per child and family, where we delivered the quality service. I'm being biased here too, but a key worker transdisciplinary evidence-based approach, and that translated to roughly 18 to 30 visits per year. So we had 2 focus groups in each phase, lots of other data that we collected through in-session records, staff meetings, progress notes, and field notes. We transcribed and de-identified all the data and manual coding process for each phase, and completed that a couple of times. As you can see, I'm skipping through those. If you want to chat later, I'm happy to. So the results. The research question 1, is individual funding compatible with family-centred practice? So broadly, individual funding was welcome, and both groups believed that scheme design should be family-centred. So remember, these are parents and professionals who had experience between 1 and 4, and in fact there was only the tinier proportion of families, like 1 participant had experience with 1 funding scheme. Most of the families had experience with 2, 3 and 4 of those funding schemes. So this is what these experienced professionals and families said, that it's a good thing overall. They embraced it. Professionals believed, however, that families with multifaceted needs required a collaborative approach, and that individual funding schemes didn't always support that collaboration. It's a common theme over the last couple of days. Both professionals and families expressed that individual funding could be family-centred, and they gave examples how, and I think this is critical. I'm presenting here, as I said, not a phase-by-phase results, just an overall picture of the results. I think that this is critical, that people who are on the ground, they know and they can tell you what's working and what's not working, and what's family-centred and what's not family-centred. Both professionals and families gave examples of elements of individual funding scheme design which were not family-centred. And finally, schemes with the most flexibility were favoured by both professionals and families. So how do families learn about individual funding? There is some of this written up in the research, and what we found was also corroborated pre-existing research, which is that families build their understanding of individual funding over time, and good advice from professionals help them to manage this extra information in a period of information overload. Families that highly valued the feedback and support and guidance and sharing from other families. So what this research added was that families identified 3 areas of information which would help them make the better decisions about how to use their funding. Firstly, they needed to know information about their child. My child has Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, autism. What does that mean? What's the future hold? What's best for my child right now? What can I expect in terms of their future and their development right now? So they needed to get their head around that. The next thing that they wanted was information about suitable interventions. And I think this is where we're coming unstuck with the NDIS, is there isn't information about suitable interventions. Here's the list of providers and off you go. And much more structure needed around that. And finally, they needed information about the actual scheme. So back at that time, families could have had between 1 and 4 different individual funding buckets. These were very adept and crafty parents, what's the purpose of this scheme? How do I figure it out? How do I maximise? But they needed to get their head around 4 different schemes. So they were really across this. So then what they did was they integrated the information from these areas to try to make the best decision for their child. And I just think that is a massive task for a family to do at a very early stage. But they did it to greater and lesser degrees. But learning over time was a key thing. We learn over time. In year 1, we got we did some good things and bad things, but then we got better in year 2, and we got better in year 3. Resources developed, helped families. We developed some. They helped families with understanding individual funding, but families still needed the professionals to mediate that information. It wasn't enough to just give them a sheet or give them a link. They really still needed to talk through with their professionals, their trusted professionals. An individual funding scheme, the scheme that we developed in-house, encouraged families to experiment and to learn from their mistakes. It was safe. There was no reasonable and necessary. You weren't going to be chased down by a government department for misuse or fraud. What are families' experiences of that planning process? Oh my God, I'm not finished. I'm going to try to speed up. Professionals believe that families did not understand the value of planning as an ongoing process which guides their decision making. And this is where my PhD took a complete other route, and I found another passion, which was how do we help and create and identify and co-design new ways for families to set a vision and plan with their children. Because families were not engaged, professionals said they weren't, and then this view was corroborated by the data. So we created some new pre-planning experiences, and the adoption of those pre-planning experiences guided by staff and mediated by staff, there was mixed reception. Some staff did it well and some families got it and others didn't have that much success with it. Something mixed. And there was consistent evidence, however, when we developed a new pre-planning, a new planning and visioning tool, there was consistent evidence when we looked at the same data sources that the families used the new planning approach, which was totally family directed. It was designed to be done by the family, and all families agreed that this was a format that made planning easy, and some highlighted that it was fun, creative, positive, and helped them to think about goals more easily, and allowed them to acknowledge also some deep-seated long-term goals that they were never going to discuss in an IFSP or an IEP meeting. It was kind of, it allowed them to internally think and tap into and process those things that are deep-seated. Will my son have a relationship? Will he have friends? Will he ever have a job? Will he live by himself? What impact does the funding have on outcomes for families? So when I talk about outcomes here, the first 2 bullet points, I thought I would look at the impact on child development, but as it got on, I realised that for me that wasn't where my interest lay. Firstly, the outcome depended on the scheme design. If the scheme funds therapy, then the families are going to chase therapy. If it funds respite, they're going to chase respite. If it funds equipment, they'll buy equipment. So I think what the lesson here was, as I was saying in the discussion, is how the scheme is set up determines what the outcomes are going to be. Outcomes of the children and families were, as I said, influenced by scheme setup, and schemes that funded therapy were welcomed by the parents and the staff. They kind of went, great, the family have got money, they can get more services. That's a good thing. But those professionals and families also contrasted the rigidity of that particular system with the more flexible system, which was much more outcomes focused. So, hey guys, you're headed towards lots of changes in your child's life. Transition to preschool, transition to school, transition into high school, transition out of your bed into their own bed. They're all important transitions. What transitions matter to you, and how are you going to spend that individual funding to help you meet that transition? That flexibility was embraced and mattered to both parents and professionals. Also, the new planning process built in goals for the family and the self, and we know from the literature that families do very rarely select goals for their whole family, even though we ask and encourage them and embrace this concept that we want them to do that. They did because it was designed in the process, but we also included select a goal for you, yourself, mum. What is your goal? Is it back into employment? Is it back to study? Is it catch up with a mate for a coffee? Is it go to bed on time? I don't know. Whatever it is, we built that in. So of course there are some limitations to the study, and including my own biases, and the last slide is the discussion. So I wanted to say the conference theme is research to action. This research was an action research. It stimulated our thinking as an organisation to think more broadly about what is individualised funding and how can it help us to meet family outcomes, child outcomes, but also not destroy and destroy, let's say it's a strong word, family-centred practice and evidence-based approaches in early childhood intervention. What it became clear to me was perhaps what we should start thinking about is, well, I don't want to say clear to me, what I started thinking about is that perhaps when we talk about individual funding, we can say that for early childhood intervention, perhaps the part of the funding which provides the early childhood intervention service for the child and family, that should be sanctioned and sacred, and then give families individual funding, perhaps a smaller amount that they can use creatively and flexibly to meet family, child and inclusion, community and other kind of family and child priorities. So I think that if we don't engage in the discussion of is the funding bad or not, if we ask ourselves the question, is the scheme set up in a way to support family-centred practice, and does the scheme still ensure that we're providing quality early childhood intervention to children and families, but while still introducing to them and nurturing them along this pathway of getting familiar and starting to learn how to use individual funding to reach quality outcomes, not just therapeutic outcomes, but quality outcomes that are going to lead them to the pathway of when their child's 18, that they're going to have an awesome life. Head them in that direction. In terms of planning, I think this is where I found my interest and also peer work, is that I thought the IFSP is to me now limited. I think it's prone to lots of different interpretations and even at risk of becoming bureaucratic. And let me not get in now, because I've definitely gone a minute or two over time now. The NDIS has stolen the word planning. It's misappropriated the word planning. That's a funding meeting and a funding conversation. That's not planning for a child and family's future. In my view, funding and planning for your child's life or goals should not happen in the same meeting. And right now, they're happening in the same meeting. So now, families don't think, they think, I've done my planning with my local area coordinator or the ECEI provider. No, that's not planning. That was a couple of hours of a meeting, or maybe even shorter. That was administrative, bureaucratic. That didn't create time for visioning and thinking about where you want your child and family. And I feel very strongly that we need to pay attention to thinking more about planning processes and creating new and innovative ways and wrestling back control of that word planning and visioning for children and their families. Investment in building capacity. In 2008, our government introduced that funding scheme with no investment in family capacity. Here's the money, off you go. Unfortunately, that's still the case with the NDIS. More needs to be done there. We tried with some mixed success, but what was key and was in the research was peer-led approaches. So that's our second passion that's emerged from the research, is we need, as an early intervention organisation, to think more about stimulating peer-led approaches. So we have engaged over the recent years families to work in our organisations. They're paid, they're trained, they develop programs, they're meeting many more families, and they're working to support, in a complementary way, the work that our wonderful ECI staff members are doing. They're a team. They're one lane of the highway and the professionals at the other lane of the highway. And we've got 2 lanes in our organisation now, and families can move between those 2 lanes. And finally, we've auspiced this year 2 parent-led organisations that focus on families of young children with disabilities, so that families can take a leadership approach to leading other families into the future. We'll still be there, we're still a part of the picture, but we're not the whole picture. Families are the whole picture, and we want to lead them to an approach where they can much more continuously get support and nourishment, encouragement and ideas from each other.